Hey everyone, today's interview is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. It's going to be about how sponsors can be better partners with clinical trial sites. So if you are working for a sponsor, if you are, say, in medical affairs and work with sites, if you are in clinical research and work with sites, you probably care about today's discussion. If you're a site, you probably care about today's discussion because we get to talk a little bit about ground realities and why what people are talking about, what people plan for, is not what sites go through on a day-to-day basis. Our guest for today is a translational scientist and a clinical research administrator at a large clinical trial network. He's experienced in academia, small biotech startups, global biotech manufacturing, and clinical research administration. Today, like we said, we're going to discuss best practices for optimal clinical site relationships. Our guest for today, Dan Fox. Hey, Dan, how are you?
Hey, Darshan, how are you doing today?
Good. Thank you again for coming on. I just want to clarify for people who are listening, we would love for you to leave a comment, please subscribe. It helps to share it on the YouTube. It helps the YouTube algorithm if you ask to share it. Also, please reach out to Dan. I know he'd enjoy that. And you can reach out to me on Twitter at DarshanTalks. Go to my website, DarshanTalks.com. You can actually find Dan on his LinkedIn, as you can see on the screen right now, or you can actually email him at dr.fox@crpnet.com, or you can also go to his website, crpnet.com as well. So before we get started, how are you, Dan? Good to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, Darshan.
Pleasure. So let's talk a little bit about this, Dan. We were talking about how sites feel like sponsors are coming in there dictating terms and not fully understanding ground realities. I just had a whole conversation earlier today on how sponsors have a different set of issues they deal with, but it's sort of interesting to see this contrast. So talk to me a little bit about what you have in mind. What are some of the biggest complaints you're seeing? Absolutely.
So first of all, I've been on both sides. I was over on the manufacturing side. I was over on the sponsor side, and we were all over there, and we saw the clinical trials going through the process, and we saw them coming out. But there was always this misconception, this misunderstanding of what was happening behind the site curtain, so to speak. Why is this taking so long? Why is our enrollment lacking? What's going on? Why is this so expensive? I don't understand. And so actually I had the privilege of going from that CRO site, or the CRO sponsor side, to the foreground, to the patient. And so I went to the site, and now I'm starting to have an understanding not only of maybe some misconceptions that sponsors might have behind that site curtain, but also maybe some miscommunications that sites might be having between the CRO and the sponsor.
Perfect. So why don't you tell us about the first one? What would that first one look like? The first biggest issue.
First of all, and this may be a matter of some of the comments that we've seen in social media and things like that from our sponsor friends and from our CRO friends, when they hear sites maybe complaining or showing concerns about things that are happening, they express comments. They say things like, well, why don't you try this? Or this is how it should happen. Or this is the policy. This is what does happen. And the one message that I could say to them is, of course, we've tried all of that. We've tried the contractual terms. We've tried solid communication pathways. We've tried everything, escalation methods. We've done everything. And somehow, some way, it still ends up falling apart, where you have sites that are ghosted. Sometimes they're forgotten. Sometimes when you send an email and you don't get a response, you just have to assume that's the answer. And sometimes you really need help. Sometimes there's an emergency and you can't get a hold of anyone. The point of contact might be on vacation for a holiday and there's no other option. Or it's just the things that we're seeing on social media, the solutions from the sponsors and the CROs for the sites aren't necessarily the solutions. Again, we're back to that site curtain, where I would highly challenge someone over there in the CRO and the site world to take my job for a day, be an administrator, and understand the frustrations that you're seeing every time you send an email, or every time that a contract isn't adhered to, or every time you're just surprised by something legally that you shouldn't be surprised by. It's just the life of a site.
So that's kind of interesting, right? You're talking about like a fundamental problem in partnerships, which is communication. I mean, it's true in a relationship, it's true in a business relationship. So in a personal relationship and a business relationship. And this lack of communication. So you've been on both sides. What would you suggest sponsors do? I mean, it's a really interesting, really simple question, right? Which is, I want to be able to communicate with you. But I can also, so let me sort of tell you what happens as a site. Sorry, as a sponsor, because I've negotiated for both sites and for sponsors. And one of the things is that you set up the relationship so that sometimes it's the CRO who has a relationship with the site. And the sponsor has delegated that, as you know, to the CRO. So does the sponsor have the ability to contact the sites, or is the CRO supposed to be in the middle handling that? So how do you sort of recommend that issue get handled?
So I've seen this done in a couple of ways. The main way that this happens generally is it's in the hands of the CRO. They take care of the budget, the contract, the negotiations, and unless it falls out of these parameters, they can handle it. And if it does fall out of the parameters, it has to be escalated to the sponsor, and then that substantially increases the timeline for everything. So I'm not quite sure from the site's perspective what happens. For example, most of the contractual negotiations I'm handling right now are literally in the hands of the sponsor. What I'm hearing from the CRO is that they're waiting on the sponsor for a reply. And that response has been very common for a month. It could be 2 weeks to a month. We're waiting on the sponsor to give a response. And you have to wonder, are we really waiting on the sponsor to do that because they're the ones that were in a huge hurry to get things going? And so I don't know if they're exactly sitting on something like that for a month at a time, or maybe there's some break in the communication there. So
how have they handled it in the past? So you just wait the 2 months?
It'll just time itself out, and eventually the sponsor will get back and we'll get something worked out, and that'll happen. I really wonder how much time we could have saved had we just done a round table with the sponsor and the CRO. Let's spend an hour on the phone to hammer everything out and then get something worked out that day instead of 1 month later.
So I'm going to propose this radical solution that I've never seen anyone propose, by the way, but have a Twitter account where it's just your help desk. And it's not that they aren't going to handle anything for you. It potentially has a ton of liability in case someone tries to put up patient information. But I love the idea of going, here's a direct communication about your clinical trials. So if someone inside is responsible for conveying your issue to the right stakeholders as necessary. But that sounds so simplistic. What am I, as a site, would you actually like that?
I mean, on our end, having some kind of an encrypted portal for a communication pathway with the party would be a wonderful idea. I'm sure my coordinators would love it. They'd love to have a direct contact. I think that sponsors on their level may also like to have it because they might feel a little more engaged with their trial. Instead of just always getting like a quarterly report from a CRO, to actually sit there and watch your trial as it's progressing, that would be pretty impressive. I would be very much engaged in that as a sponsor.
So we're talking a little bit about this communication pathway. Are you finding that CROs are, and again, we're talking about the CROs you're working with, and again, both of us I've worked with sponsors, CROs, and sites, and they all have different issues and different perspectives. Communication always seems to be the one that breaks down. I think that people tend to automatically default to formal communications when informal communications will probably get you a lot farther, a lot faster. Whether we're talking about audits, whether we're talking about responses to audits, whether we're talking about something else. So I find this idea of just going, hey, I have a question, to be a lot easier. I mean, the closest thing I see, and it's interesting. I was following some of the LinkedIn communications, and one of them was how IRBs are really, really difficult to deal with right now. And I'm sure you followed that as well. But the one thing you have to say, though, for the larger IRBs, that what they do get right is that they have a central portal. We will only respond to communications that are sent via the central portal. So send them via that process. And that portal can be set up to communicate with the IRB. But theoretically, you could just add on additional recipients, which might be the sponsor. So what you're suggesting is some version of that. But yeah, go ahead.
That could, well, and now we go into the whole Gidget, Gadget, e-thingy platform communication, where you have to keep in mind that these sites are doing more trials than what belongs to this one sponsor.
Yeah.
For that to work, you would actually have to have some kind of an agreed upon portal that maybe the sites could choose. Maybe the sites could say, hey, we use this portal. If you do a trial with us, we can use this one technology. We don't have to train on 50 technologies to adhere to every sponsor's need.
I was just doing another podcast with a friend, and the friend was a technology provider, and another one of our common friends responded with, the bane of my existence as a site is I can't remember my password. So it's exactly the problem you're discussing, which is realistically 50 different portals. But here's the problem with what you're suggesting. I like this idea of me saying sort of what might be the defense, but maybe it's not, and it's not about being defensive. It's about sort of going, here are the different perspectives as a site, as a sponsor, as a CRO, and what are we missing, and how do we best communicate? But what you're talking about is essentially saying, let's have sponsors use this preferred portal from this set of sites. But what if they want to work with multiple sites? Now the sponsor is responsible for maintaining 6-7 different portals, and each portal may want their own licensing fee and may want their own everything, and that makes things a lot more difficult. So it's interesting, as part of this conversation, another communication I saw was sites saying, can we quote unquote unionize? And what was your take on that?
I think that would be a very interesting thing. If you were to unionize, then maybe you could have an established portal across at least a certain network of sites where the sponsors wouldn't have to manage so many different technologies. And the paradigm that you just discussed is the exact cost shift from site to sponsor and from sponsor to site. We've been exchanging it for decades now. Who is going to hold the bill for this or that? I think that from my experience, this industry, this business model is the only one where the service provider is actually the one who's expected to build processes for every single customer. So you put it into like a restaurant. I think I put that on LinkedIn. If you had a restaurant where every single customer came into the restaurant and told you, you have to use my kitchen tools to build my dinner, that restaurant kitchen would look like a mess.
Right.
The restaurants will choose the tools that they have to be the best restaurant possible. And so they'll cook every meal with the same tools. So you could apply that to an auto mechanic or all these other things with the one industry where the customer actually thinks that they can control the processes of the people they're seeking services from. It's fascinating to me.
Very, very interesting. So one of the other sort of complaints that you're referring to inside in the conversations we're having is this use and reliance on all these gadgets. As a site, is that, I know that most technology vendors are going, I want to simplify this process. And these technologies, I mean, I was talking to one that's gamified the system. There are others who are saying it's not about gamification, it's about direct communications and enabling these communications. In your experience, are there too many technologies in there, or do we just need a better technology?
I think every technology has its strength by far. I think that you're going to find that there are so many technology options out there that you're only going to inundate the sites even more. Eventually, what you're going to see happen is a streamlined technology field where one way or the other, there's going to be a winner. And that winner, similar to, in tech, you've got your Apples and your Microsofts, your Androids. So something is going to happen where you're going to have giant mergers and you're going to have one or two big dogs on top. And as a result, then you're going to have that streamlined unification where all sites know how to use Apple or Android, or you pick the technology, and then that may actually work. The problem that we're having now is specifically there's so many different flavors that we just get overwhelmed.
So that's the question, though, right? So it again reminds me of the IRB conversation, where the conversation was there are only two sort of systems out there, but people don't like either system. And it reminds me of the EMR world as well, where they say you've got your Cerner and your Epic, but I don't like either one. And you've got others that are much, much smaller, but they don't get the same airtime, if you will, for lack of a better term. My question for you is, you talk about this idea of congealing or unifying the systems, but do you think that if we did that, we would have one of my favorite sayings is, a camel is a horse drawn by consensus. So do you think we'd get a camel instead of a good horse if we try to keep congealing and trying to address all the problems through one system?
Yes. So there are some downsides to that. The lack of competition could just cause complacency.
Right.
And so as a result, you're going to have to find a good balance between that. The clinical research realm is growing exponentially. I think by 2030, we're supposed to be near 84 billion, where we're at 49 billion now. So there's going to be plenty of room. Yeah, there's plenty of room for technology to grow.
Yeah.
But we have to figure out some way for the technology to sync so that we don't put too much of a burden on the people who are doing the work.
Yeah. So how do you enable the people who are doing the work to be better stakeholders in the sense that we enable them to actually have a voice? What do you think is missing in this process?
I think the first piece is to actually view the people who are doing the work, the clinical site, as a true partner to the system. Part of that has to do with, I'm not sure where this came from, but there's a very big subservient feeling about clinical sites. You've heard, and we've all heard it. It's not a secret. Sponsors saying, well, I didn't like this site. I didn't like how they performed, so I'm just going to drop them. Right. Or they made me mad, or they said the wrong thing, or we're just going to drop them. Or, I'm sure you've looked at legal terms and contractual terms where these contracts are literally designed to treat sites as a subservient, disposable vendor.
Okay.
So the very first thing that you really need to do, let's just get down to the roots. We need to break the culture of subservience. So sites are the professionals that deserve the respect to at least have sponsors and CROs adhere to their promises in the contracts. It's not much to ask for people to actually keep their promises on the dotted line that they signed. To step all over the clinical site realm and to say, we're a big sponsor, we're going to do this, or you're expendable and we don't need you, and you don't have the rights that we promised you in the papers that we signed. That's the first thing that we're going to have to break if we really want to enable the people to do the services at an optimal quality. Let's just get back to human rights, right? So it's kind of ironic that we're in an industry that is so focused on consent and so focused on rights that we actually treat the people who are treating the patients in some pretty poor ways.
So can you be more specific? Poor ways how?
So broken contracts, that's the number one thing. We are an industry of paper, right? So we all come together, we make an agreement, we sign the paper.
Yeah.
It might be a good idea to read that paper and understand the promises that were made and to adhere to them. If
So
you're going,
can you give me an example of the types of promises that get broken?
absolutely. So number one is, of course, the money. Money is the big elephant in the room. Let's talk about money. Let's talk about, if you have a net 30 contract that you sign, it might be a good idea to have that money in the account within 30 days of the promised service. That would be an agreed upon rate. If you have a net 30 contract, you don't want to average out to be 120 days post service to actually get the sites their money.
Right.
If you promise sites a startup money so they can actually go through and get your study started up in a reasonable amount of time, or even expedite it because you're in such a hurry, it might be a good idea to give them the resources they need to do the work, not have to make them wait 6 months. So money is only part of it. I have learned about the majority of my contracts through my regulatory team, whether it's a protocol amendment that was established 6 months ago that never had a legal agreement, or whether it's the fact that we were awarded a trial. And so, you've got the regulatory team trying to file your 1572s and get all the documentation in when our legal team doesn't even have an agreement or a budget yet.
Right.
So there's just a lot of inconsistencies on the legal level that just compromises the basic rights of a professional in this industry.
So let's talk about that, right? So we talk about this idea that the contract itself is unenforceable, which I think is a travesty. However, the truth is, I'm thinking of multiple things, right? So the first thing is, it is very routine as a lawyer that people only adhere to the terms that they think are important in the contract. Now, what happens is that every so often you kind of go, yeah, I consider this part to be important. For example, payment terms are important. Like, this is not a negotiable thing. But overall, I'm sure there are parts of the contract where you're kind of going, yeah, it's in there, but no one's ever read that thing. But if I have to enforce it, it's in there. But payment terms are kind of critical. So I get your overall concern. Do you think that something like the arbitration provisions that are often in contracts are useful, or do you think that the fact that they all generally default to legal options is what makes them slightly unenforceable because you're going against a behemoth pharma company?
I think that as far as arbitration goes, it's pretty standard, but you're spot on. What are sites going to do in the event of a breach? Right. And the answer is we don't really have a whole lot we can do. I mean, I've heard some stories. You can write letters of protest. You can do things like that, but I mean, what can you do? That's where sites often resort to maybe data. That's the one thing that they can provide.
So I've seen a few different things that I've seen done. For example, I've seen sites basically say, look, this is a breach of contract. And as a breach of contract, we're going to adhere to the terms of the breach of the contract, including whether the data is available or not. So whether that's right, wrong, that's a different discussion, but I've seen that type of discussion being had. Another version of that conversation I've seen is sites demanding that they have X amount of money up front. And whether they then become a deprioritized site is a different discussion. But the point being that you're now working with a set of sponsors that are working on the terms you want to work with. And that gives you a certain flexibility. I mean, it's the same problems that lawyers face, right? As lawyers, we struggle with this idea of, what if we do the work and we don't get paid either on time or at all? And the way lawyers address this issue is by saying we need a fixed fee that's going to either be paid monthly, or there is going to be a pot of money that I pull from, and as it goes down, then you need to replenish it before any more work happens. CROs work off of that model as well. So my question to you is that something sites need to actively consider? And if sites do consider that, would that position them as problematic? But is that worth the problems? Because they now are only working with sponsors that understand their issues.
So that has actually been a very good idea that we've been considering. We call it drawdown accounts or something like
Yeah.
that.
Escrow,
Oftentimes we could do a drawdown account. Actually, I just did a contract where they agreed to pay for the first 10 patients up front. So we actually had money from the first 10 enrolled patients. Of course, that's refundable if we don't enroll the proper amount of patients. That contract worked seamlessly. We got the money immediately. We had what we needed. There was, I guess you'd call it a buffer. So the financial buffer between time and service was right there. It worked like a dream. Good luck trying to get a sponsor to do that. That was a really hard sell just to try to get a sponsor to agree to that.
Yeah. So what you are landing up with is there are fewer sponsors who are going to agree to that. But that's true with every situation, right? Because every time you want something that favors you, it disfavors them. Because again, I'll speak from the sponsor's perspective. What if the site doesn't perform? Now I have to chase a site to get paid for something that they're holding my money on for, and that's problematic. Because A, I don't want to be in the business of chasing sites. B, the site now is going to argue that they deserve the money anyways. C, I don't want to piss off a physician who's probably working in my space. So all of which is not ideal. So drawdown accounts work great as a concept, but maybe instead of seeing it as a drawdown, you see it more as an escrow, and that changes ownership, and that might, but again, it increases costs, but that might be worth it overall. But those are the different types of conversations I have had. What was your experience with this drawdown account?
It was great, and we had that same exact conversation. What if you don't do the work? What if, what if all of this stuff happens? And the site's response was, and it was my response, it was, we have given you no reason not to trust us. You've already vetted us through a feasibility. You've already vetted us through that. You've awarded us the trial, which means you've awarded us the trust to run your trial. Unless we've given you a reason to not to trust us, which we wouldn't have, otherwise we wouldn't have gotten the trial, there should be no reason to punish us for something that we're trying to do.
I understand the logic, and again, like I said, I just recommended, like, that's an idea that I've thrown out there. But I can also, it's sort of still, you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars, if not in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the type of study you're in the middle of. I can see a sponsor being a little gun shy. I can also see a sponsor dealing with the struggle of it's now money that's out of my account that I can't use for rollover purposes. So there are, if it's a large sponsor, maybe they can afford it, but a startup or a pre-commercial company would have much tighter budgets, and then they're struggling with that part of it. So do you think that this strategy works primarily for larger sponsors compared to smaller ones?
Yes, absolutely. The big question is who's going to hold the debt for the longest amount of time? And you're pretty much going to find that most of the sponsors are going to try to put the debt on the site.
Right.
So that's that's the giant tug of war that we call the industry. But as you have to go back and forth on that.
Dan, we can keep continuing this conversation, but we're well past time. This is such a fun conversation to have. So thank you so much for being part of this. Any parting words before we go?
Just please, very much so, consider what a site is going through. We're really here to help you. We're here to serve, and your success is our success. We're not the enemy, so let's all work together to get this done.
And speaking of, before we go down and close it, one of the things I did want to talk to you about was Crpnet, which is your system, and you were talking about these are ways to actually evaluate the relationship between sponsors and sites. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So the Clinical Research Payment Network has developed what we call the PACT score. It's essentially a risk assessment so that we can understand the behaviors of CROs and sponsors, not as a defense mechanism per se, but almost like a biometric. A lot of us we like to have the wearables to understand how our body's doing, and that's what this PACT score is doing. I've had sponsors reach out to me. How can I be a better sponsor? How can I serve my sites? And I can tell them, this is how. Here's your assessment. We can look at how you're behaving, how sites are perceiving you, and how you can have a better image so you can have more successful trials.
And what's on this PACT score? How is that calculated?
So PACT stands for promises, access, choice, and trust. 4 variables that are very important to sites. Promises, you just do what you say, whether it be an email or your payments. Access, you do have access to everything that you need to do the trial, from supplies being shipped to you on time all the way to lack of withholding the money. That's another whole other podcast we could talk about. Choice, the choice to sites are very important. That's where we go back to that restaurant with all of the gadgets. So if you give sites the choice to do the trial as they see fit so that they can do it in their best capacity, it's going to be better. And then trust is the multiplier. So trust among all of the other 3 variables, that can show you the extent of how good your relationship is.
I love it. And they can just go to CRPayNet and get the information.
Yes, they can.
Perfect. Again, thank you so much for coming on. This was wonderful, and we can't wait to have you back.
All right. Thank you so much,